When I first sensed I was potentially moving out of a high demand religion, I was scared. It felt like falling. No roadmap, no rules, just this unnerving question echoing in my head. If I'm not obedient anymore, then who am I? That's what we're unpacking today. How to move from a life built on obedience to one anchored in integrity. Next on the Almost Awakened podcast.
Healing begins in the body, but awakening touches everything: relationships, purpose, identity, pleasure, and truth. Join Bill Reel and Teresa Hobbs as they explore the real work of becoming a healthier you. Welcome to Almost Awakened.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Almost Awakened podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bill Reel.
Hi, everyone. I am Teresa Hobbs.
And we're grateful to have you with us today. So today's conversation is titled From Obedience to Integrity, Rebuilding Identity from the Inside Out. And I want to put up a slideshow. So I'm going to go back here to this first slide and put this up, that over there. There's the thumbnail. Who am I without obedience? It's got the church-going woman on the left-hand side. It's got her letting down her guard and being her vulnerable self and moving to a place of integrity there on the right. I'll just note, as we start this conversation, from obedience to integrity, rebuilding an identity from the inside out, how to form a self that isn't shaped by fear, duty, or expectation. And you did want to say something about us splitting this episode up. I'll let you comment on that.
We're going to do this in two parts. And the first part is going to be just about what it's like to go through this process, to sort of point out what people are feeling and to give some context around that. And then the second part, we're going to focus more on how to come back into that integrity and how to move into more self-trust and embodiment. So we thought it would be nice to kind of separate this into two parts so people could take some time to really, really internalize and process this.
And to begin the conversation, we have to lay some foundations. So there's a picture of somebody taking little clay blocks and building a brick wall, but we're going to start at the very bottom. There's 5 things I want to sort of set as foundational anchors to this conversation. And the first is that this is a tender transition. Folks are not just losing their beliefs. And most of you who listen to this podcast have been through this. And I think it's a great reminder because all over the course of your life, you may have opportunities to interact, connect with other people who are going through the same thing. And I think it's a great reminder of maybe what your experience entailed, some of the components it had. And for those of you who are tuning in and you're in some part of that early stages of a faith transition, I would just want to note this is a tender transition. And so people should give themselves a lot of grace. And if it's somebody you know or somebody you connect with, give them a lot of grace. You're not just losing your beliefs, you're rebuilding a sense of self. And it is tender because in this space, we often hear this moment called the dark night of the soul. And it's called that for a reason. You're born into, or maybe you converted to, but for many people, they're born into a high demand religious system or a really unhealthy, rigid family system. And the only way you know how the world works is by what the authorities of that system told you, whether it's parents, a religious leader, it can be other authorities as well, but what they set up as the standard of behavior, what they say are the boxes that need to be checked in the list of things to do, if they determine what's sin and what's righteousness. And so you grow up in a system where you have all of these expectations placed on you about what it means to be a good person among these people, among this system. And you don't know any better. And at some point you learn something, you read something, you think about something, you have a question, and then you start to notice that the system really isn't as true or as accurate or as honest as you had expected it to be. And that can be shattering because not only is it the beliefs in the outside world of things that you hold, but it's also how you've defined yourself up into this moment. And so I'll just note that again, it's tender. Number two, obedience shaped your identity. If you were in the system and you were trying to be good at that system, I was a Mormon and I was trying to be the best Mormon I could be. And I was measured by my obedience. If I didn't drink coffee, I was obedient. If I didn't drink tea, I was obedient. If I stayed away from swear language, if I showed up at all the service opportunities, if I went to church every Sunday, if I wore a white collared shirt instead of a blue collared shirt. There are so many rules in many religions, and especially in high demand fundamentalist ones. And your identity, whereas it should be like who you are, what is your grounded self? What do you want your life to look like? What do you like to do or what do you not like to do? Uh, what are your values? But none of that matters in the system. The system has already set those up for you, and your job is to conform. In conforming to wear a mask and be the idea of yourself that something or someone else has of you isn't your real identity. But you didn't know that until you started to take things apart. And so obedience shaped your identity. Your worth was tied to following, not choosing.
Yeah, and I wanna say something here because this reminds me, especially in the Mormon culture, the idea of, choose the right, or, they always sort of, frame it under the guise of choice, and that you are choosing to be obedient, you're choosing the right side of something, which means that you are a good person, you are a good member, whatever it is. But it's not really choice.
Yeah, and in Mormonism, we have this doctrine of agency, which is supposed to be the ability to choose for oneself. And even that, over especially the last 5 or 6 years, has been corrupted by the current leadership, where they say you don't really have agency. Your agency is to only do what we told you to do. And I'll just note that whenever you're forced to choose, and again, you can choose otherwise. I mean, certainly Mormonism and any other religion would say, no, 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 that's not true. You actually do have choice. And that's true. Like, you could choose to do the exact opposite of what the system says, except you'll be cast out. You'll be diminished in terms of how that system talks about you, how it teaches members of the system, often your family, to perceive you. And so you'll be the black sheep, essentially, uh,
Yeah.
if you act differently.
But it's based on a lie. So it's not a true choice because they're saying here is one choice is this, it's salvation. The other choice is that you're cast out. And that isn't actually a choice based on truth or reality. So in reality, it's not a choice. It's not a true choice.
Yeah. And so number three is freedom is disorienting at first. You have really enjoyed the certainty that your system gave you, and you haven't had a chance to relish in curiosity or to relish in autonomy. And so now you move from this place where everything was answered, all the questions of life were answered, all the doctrines were laid out, all the truths were stated, and you were able to enjoy a certainty in that. But as that begins to unravel, to come apart, you now have to figure out who you are and what you want your life to look like. So freedom is very disorienting at first. Leaving control systems often brings confusion, not clarity. Number four is integrity isn't rebellion. The system teaches that when you choose to trust your gut and to use your voice and to stand up for yourself and to stand out for who you are, the system teaches that that is rebellion, that you are running contrary to God's will. And and it should be noted, integrity isn't rebellion. When you start to go, nope, my system is what has the problem. It's the authorities in this system that have the issue. My gut, my intuition is right about this thing, and I can't follow along anymore. That isn't rebellion. That is integrity. It's not the opposite of obedience. It's the birth of wholeness. And then the last one here, we're not giving answers today. Um, Often in other shows that I do, I'm laying data out and I'm arguing for certain conclusions based on the strength of evidence. What I want to do today is simply say, here's a process that happens among human beings, and certain unhealthy systems manipulate people and take advantage of the way in which we think, the way in which we feel inside us, sort of pulled to do things, to be loyal to the group. They are things that we've done often for the benefit of our survival over thousands of years. And it really is a difficult thing to start to push against that and to run counter to it. Um, our goal today is to just give you some information on the process and give you space to figure out your own answers. So our goal is simply to make space for your answers to emerge.
Yeah,
And
and to validate the process, to validate your experience, to put a name to something that many people may be experiencing but don't understand, and to support people to understand and feel held in their experience and to know that it's really, really normal.
yeah. So I want to start with obedience. And obedience isn't all bad. And I'll just read this here. It says, in a healthy society, obedience plays a vital role. It's what allows complex systems to function. Traffic flows without accidents, schools function benefiting the collective, laws are upheld, ensuring maximum freedom and justice for all, and communities maintain order, minimizing rebellions and riots. At its best, obedience reflects a collective trust. We agree to follow certain rules, not out of fear, but because we believe they serve the common good. It's an act of social cohesion, an acknowledgement that we are part of something bigger than ourselves. When aligned with justice and mutual respect, obedience isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It creates safety, predictability, and shared purpose. But that only works when the system is actually worthy of trust. Obedience becomes dangerous when it asks us to betray our conscience, suppress our instincts, or deny reality to preserve power. When is it noble to follow? When is it necessary to stand alone, or maybe even to stand against? And those are the questions we have to weigh. And when you're in a religious system, and again, I'll use Mormonism as an example. We have one leader's quote that says, "It is wrong to criticize leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true." And I would just note that every system that's healthy allows a real legitimate process for the collective of that system, the people of that system, to raise their hand to unhealthy behavior, to manipulation, to abuse. And any system that says no matter what we do, it is wrong to criticize us or the system, you can know right away that there is something deeply unhealthy about that. And so I would only note that obedience in and of itself is a crucial component of our society, and that all of us we just can't willy-nilly about the rules and the laws, but we do have to have room to go, hey, the leaders of this system are saying XYZ, and that runs counter to my conscience, and I have to have a forum or a platform or a process by which the system hears me and weighs the merit of what I said. And so sometimes you have to stand out. And that's part of what happens in this process, because otherwise you would just continue to be an obedient cog in the machine. And so some of the terms that I would at least want to note, and we all recognize that these have a extremely healthy place in our society, but they can go too far. And I would want everyone listening to the show today to consider, it's not my job to determine when you should practice these things or where it goes too far. but to just note that I think this is a complex conversation. It's a complex facet of this conversation about when you follow in line and when you break the rules. So, for instance, we say speeding is wrong, and we have signs up that give a speed limit, and all of us determine for ourselves how we're going to follow that rule or not. Some people go, well, it's perfectly okay to go 5 miles over the speed limit, and the cops won't stop me. I think for the most part that's true, but you're still breaking the speed limit. Uh, you can go a little slower than the speed limit, but also some degree of too slow is also dangerous. If you go too fast, there may be good reasons to go too fast. Uh, Maybe you have an injured person in your car and you're driving to the hospital and you've got to speed. Um, in other instances, you're simply making a choice that you were running late this morning and you're going to speed in order to get to somewhere on time. And some of those are simply breaking the rules for unhealthy reasons and running counter to the established rules of our society. And in other instances, you're making a decision to do what many would say is the right thing to do in order to protect yourself or others. And I'll just note conscientious objection, typically used in legal or military context. It broadly applies to refusing to comply with a rule, law, or norm, or moral or on moral or ethical grounds. Moral courage, the bravery to act on one's ethical convictions, even when it means defying authority or facing consequences. Civil disobedience, public, nonviolent refusal to obey unjust laws or policies, usually to prompt reform. Think Thoreau, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. Ethical dissent, pushing back on an institutional or cultural norm due to personal integrity or ethical reasoning. Principled defiance, resistance rooted not in rebellion for its own sake, but in a commitment to truth, justice, or higher values. And I say all of that to say that all of us have to make decisions every day that we will keep the agreements that the society has set. It's not like we woke up one day and somebody said, here, sign this contract that you'll follow all the rules of this country. And there are processes in this country by which to have your grievances heard. And some of those work really well, and some of those hardly work at all. And so you have to make decisions every day about what degree of obedience to the system is appropriate for the protection and safety, justice of others, and for the safety and justice and protection of yourself. And when it comes to being in an unhealthy religious system, you can tell they're unhealthy because they don't have an active process by which you can actually cause any change. And I'll give an example again using Mormonism. There used to be this idea that you would, in general conference, so Mormons get together every 6 months to hear their leaders. And it's called General Conference, and the leaders will stand up at the pulpit and they teach things. But one of the things that they do at the beginning of these conferences is they ask the members if they sustain the leaders, and you would raise your hand to essentially vote either in the affirmative or the negative about sustaining the leadership. In today's world, if you raise your hand in disagreement, they simply ignore it. They send you back to your local leader, and even if you had a just cause, there's nothing's going to come about. And the process didn't used to work that way, but over time, they've made it so that that process doesn't work effectively at all. And every system that's healthy needs a way that you can have real grievances heard and something gets done about them. But in an unhealthy religion, the people who raise their hand are either labeled as negative in some way, or they are cast out of the group and they have their voice minimized. And you can immediately tell which systems do that and which ones allow for healthy conversation around what someone sees as a problem. And so I just want to note those. The Anything you want to say about those, by the way, how you make a decision of when you go like, hey, I have problems in this system, but I just keep my mouth shut and do what they tell me? Or when do you raise your hand and start to push against the system, saying like, hey, I can't tolerate that we're hurting people here? Do you have any thoughts there?
I do. I mean, it just so many people have experiences where they have asked questions, just even asked questions, or brought up something that was incongruent, or brought up something they had an issue with, in a church system or whatever that is. And they are silenced. They are told that that they're creating doubt, that it's not acceptable, that it's not okay, and they are silenced or shamed for it. And the message to everybody else is, don't go there. And so it keeps people in line, and they realize that they're not allowed to point out any flaws or issues. And I'm sure there are many other people in the room that have the same feeling, but they're told to shove it back down. And that continues to create that internal conflict, and that cognitive dissonance within. And yeah, but if you want to be part of the group, that's what you do. You maintain your complete obedience, and at the cost of your integrity. And it's a heavy weight for a lot of people.
Yeah, this idea that someone is labeled bad, they are creating doubts within the community about the religion, about the leaders, and that's not allowed. And I would ask, how does one point out a flaw in the system without raising doubts? I mean, if you step outside of your religion and you go to the PTA or the Rotary Club or the local yoga class, and you're in these groups of people, and if somebody is being abusive, somebody is being unhealthy, or somebody is teaching something which will manipulate people and is not true, the only way you can draw attention to it is to draw attention to it. And so the system essentially comes along and goes, no, you're not allowed to draw attention to this thing. That would be sinful. That would be bad. But that's the kind of language the system and its leaders use to insulate themselves against criticism. The only way you can point out flaws in the system is to point out flaws in the system. And any system that tries to say, well, not here, you can do that elsewhere, but you can't do that here, is again telling you right on the front end that it doesn't allow criticism here. It wouldn't matter what we do. It wouldn't matter if we commit financial fraud. It wouldn't matter if we make safe spaces for child abuse. It wouldn't matter if we are dishonest about our history. It wouldn't matter if our leaders are caught lying. It wouldn't matter because there's no real viable process by which a person could be heard pointing those out. And when you notice that your system is doing that, this is when you start to come to a place where maybe you're not going to be obedient anymore, and you're going to start to stand on your own 2 feet and stand on your own ground. So there's that. So obedience as identity. And obedience as identity. In high demand systems specifically, you were told who to be, and your sense of self was shaped to fit a mold. You had a role over authenticity. So every human being in a religious system, and it doesn't matter, we could take the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Methodist, there are certain expectations placed on you. Beliefs, for instance. So if you're a Methodist, you believe a set of things that the Catholics don't believe, and you don't believe the things the Catholics believe. And you make an agreement up front that you're going to, believe in those things that the Methodists do. But over time, you read books and you think about things and you ask questions and you watch podcasts and you read go to a presentation, or you read something on a website, and suddenly you've got questions or you see the data differently, and now you realize that, yeah, maybe your system's right about a lot of things, but it seems to miss the mark on some of the positions that it holds or some of the doctrines that it teaches. And again, it's only in this world of religion where we go, no, no, it was set up perfectly. You can't question it. You have to buy into 100% of it forever and ever, and you can't ever change your mind. When out in the real world, it's perfectly normal to change our minds. And when you're in a system where you have to fit a role, where you have to hold a certain set of beliefs and you're not allowed to change ever, well, then it's crystal clear that your authentic self isn't welcome, because your authentic self is always shifting and moving and learning and taking on new beliefs and discarding old ones that no longer work or hold value for you. And so, roll over authenticity. You weren't a person, you were an extension of the system. It imposed that you conform in order to best suit the spiritual system's needs. The second one is obedience was currency. You earned love, approval, belonging by suppressing your doubts, your desires, and most importantly, your authentic self. Being what they told you to be was how you got praise. And then number three, instinct became suspect. So I've had so many times in my life where I was in a moment in a religion and I could feel that something was off. And I think I felt it long before my brain could logic it out, because the system had told me what to believe and how to believe it and what were all the answers to all of life's questions. And it told me how to interpret history and who to listen to and to trust and who not to. And so there are these moments where my gut or my intuition said something's off here. That leader is not being healthy. This system is teaching something untrue. This system is asking something of me that isn't fair to demand. And I said ask, but really it demands of us something that doesn't seem fair. And so I'll just note that wanting something, feeling something, questioning something, those were seen as threats to the system, and everyone around you, including your loved ones, were trained to interpret such signals as a threat. So the moment you start to go, I don't know if I'm on board with what this system teaches, the system has taught your loved ones, your community members, to look at you with disdain, to dismiss you, to get distance from you, and to not trust anything you say. And anytime you start to trust your gut rather than be loyal, it's going to be seen with suspicion. And most importantly, you've been taught to see your own instinct with suspicion. And so it's a whole new adventure to learn to trust your gut again and not to let others determine whether that's right or wrong. Do you have any thoughts on those three things?
So many. So, uh, yeah, it does absolutely train you to put the system, so you trust the system implicitly, which means that any internal desires that you have, you see as, like you said, suspect. So you distrust your own self. You learn to distrust your own gut, your own instincts, and it's so damaging. And we were having this conversation a couple weeks ago. One of the things that I think is really amazing about you were a convert and you grew up, you were like what, 17 before you joined the church. So you had and you didn't grow up in Utah, so you didn't have the influence of the Mormon culture, whether you were a member or not. I still think it affects people whether they're, a member of the church or not. And there were two other people and myself in this conversation, and we'd all grown up in Utah and around the Mormon culture, and we were recognizing that there was a distinct difference in how well you actually were able to trust your gut. Yes, you became part of the Mormon system, but there was so many times as you were learning things that you were like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't, where those of us who grew up in the culture, we just kind of bypassed it. It was like, well, I can't trust myself. I can't trust this internal signal that's happening inside. I have to shut it down because this system is right. And this system is reinforced by my entire culture, and so it's such a powerful influence, and it's so hard to learn how to reconnect with yourself and regain your self-trust and to start to look at the system as suspect rather than yourself. And another thought I had is, it's it embeds this idea that, like, if you are not obedience, you are failing. This obedience as identity is like you are a failure, you are not worthy if you don't consistently follow the rules to the T. And that's just it's just so problematic. We learn to fear making mistakes. This is why so many people who come from high demand fundamentalist religions end up stuck in perfectionism, which can really erode your life. You can't you don't feel like you can have any freedom to make mistakes or be wrong. And one of the things I had to do when I was, healing, and I didn't have a name for religious deconstruction when it was happening to me. I was about 20 years old when I left the church, but I noted all these internal conflicts that I had, and one of them that became really clear to me was this fear of making a mistake, this fear of failure. And I just want to share this because I think it's interesting and because it was really helpful for me. Is I learned I had this moment where I realized I needed to sort of redefine what failure was, what making a mistake was. And so I kind of got curious about what it means to fail. And there were a couple of things that were really helpful for me, and it was around the idea of all the people who've been really successful in life. There was a story I heard about Thomas Edison, how he he as he was trying to invent the light bulb, he said, I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. And something about that really clicked for me to help redirect my mind from this idea of failure to like making failure actually inevitable, making it something to celebrate along the path of success, um, to help soften the intensity I felt over ever making a mistake or not getting something right or, not succeeding immediately. So those are just some thoughts that I had around this because that's how deeply this whole obedience as identity impacted me. The cutting myself off from my own truth and this deep difficulty I had around, feeling like I've made a mistake.
Yeah, and I just want to, before I go to the next slide, just notice all of us who have been in unhealthy family systems, have been in unhealthy religious systems. We don't really understand where our self ends and where the system starts. We're all sort of cogs in a machine, and it tells us where to be and what to do and how to do it, what to believe and what we can participate in and what we can't, who to trust and who not to. And so it's such a new thing that feels so scary when you start to get out of that to any degree. The moment you start to go, something isn't right here, I'm going to lean into figuring out what that is. It is one of the scariest moments that someone can have in their life. And so I wanted to put up a few images that I was just looking up obedience online and trying to find a few things that, to some degree, I'll just self admit, these might be triggering for people. And I'm sorry, but I wanted you to sense how religion frames these things. So in this one, this is the Emmanuel Methodist Church. Identity and obedience determines our destiny. So, your identity, and whatever the Emmanuel Methodist Church determines that is, and your obedience to their system, to God as they see it, is it leads to, where do you get in the afterlife? Do you get back to God? Do you make it to heaven, or do you end up in hell because you didn't have the identity we needed you to have and be obedient to the things that we said you need to be obedient to? And there's that. So then here's a scale and you've got obedience and belief and the love of Christ. And so what one believes and how one adheres to the system's rules determine whether you love Christ or not. And so if your gut tells you that their rules are flawed, and your gut tells you that you can't, with good conscience, live your life the way this system that used this slide, the way they tell you to, or if your brain can't hold the beliefs that they say you need to hold, because we really are a product of whatever our brain tells us to believe. So, for instance, if I say, Teresa, I want you to believe in leprechauns. I could tell you that all day long, but you couldn't believe in leprechauns because you know they're not true, and your brain has already made a decision. And so some people treat belief as if you can just believe in spite of the evidence, like have faith and believe anyway. But the reality is that there's a certain threshold at which it crosses that no matter who tries to tell you to believe, you're not going to be able to. And an image like this isn't subtle, but maybe what it's doing is sort of subtle, but it is telling the viewer of this image that if you're not obedient in the way that we say, and you don't believe in the way that we say, then you don't really love Christ. And that's the kind of messages that religions use to manipulate us to not question, to get in line, to be obedient, and to follow the system and its leaders. Here's one. Obedience is better than sacrifice. Well, obedience to what? Because when I look at the Old Testament and New Testament, for example, there are tons of rules in there that even modern Christianity goes, no, we don't follow that anymore. That's absurd. And so it's obedience to what? Which rules is it? Who gets to pick and choose? Which ones have been cast off and which ones have been added? And again, it's the system and its leaders that are determining what good obedience is. And what they're saying here in this image is that obedience to that system and its rules is better than sacrifice. Well, I would never, ever state this as all true or all false. There are really good times to be obedient to things that are in the scriptures. By the way, I'm an atheist, but I think there are good rules in there. There are also really bad rules in there. And so obedience for me, would need to be determined on the merit of any single commandment or rule given. Same with sacrifice. Sacrifice can be really good. Sacrifice can be harmful and contrary to self-care. Every moment of whether one sacrifices or not would have to be weighed on the merit of what it is that's going on. And any institution or system that just says it's always this over that is trying to manipulate people into being loyal to the system rather than giving anyone the ability to think for themselves and to discern based on their intuition and conscience and gut. And I think that's the big difference between the immaturity that systems want often from their members versus the depth and wisdom that come in when one makes decisions based on each situation. I think I got one more, but any thoughts on any of these images or sort of how they work to get people to stay in line?
I have thoughts, but on other aspects, so keep going.
Okay. So here's one. Obedience is required. Well, obedience to what? Obedience to who? Obedience when? And this one here is a Mormon one from a general conference in 2013. Obedience is required. Okay. But we need to have a conversation about that. Is obedience required to when they tell me to be quiet rather than raise my hand to abuses that are happening? Because that wouldn't be right. That wouldn't be healthy. And so I just note that religious images with words on them, trying to tell people what to obey and what not to. Uh, Obedience is the system's tool to get you to not be a problem, to get you to not cause any drama, and to not draw any attention to anything that's unhealthy within the system itself. Um, so that's the last one. And then I want to talk for a moment about Plato's Cave. So do you have any thoughts up to here? Otherwise, I'll just go into this. So are you familiar with Plato's Cave, Teresa? I'm sure you are.
I'm not actually.
You're not. Okay. So Plato gave this analogy where there were people who were trapped in the cave, represented by the man who's sitting down to the right there. And they can't see behind them. They've got a wall, they're up against a wall, and all they see is the far side of the cave. All they see is the images on the wall that somebody is putting up by holding like an image of a bird on a stick. And so the person sees the shadow of the bird on the wall, and that to them is the bird because they've never experienced anything else. And this analogy of Plato's cave is often used to teach all of us that when we're born into systems, we only see with the lens that we've been given. At some point, the people who are trapped in the cave aren't trapped anymore, and they realize that there's a whole world on the other side of them. And they realize that they've been tricked into believing that the bird on the wall was in fact a bird on the wall, when really in reality it was they were being manipulated into seeing something and interpreting it a certain way. And so they finally escape the cave. And when they escape the cave, they exit the system. They stop seeing through solely that lens, and they start to see the world as it really is. And it's a famous analogy. The story, from Plato's Cave has been used over and over and over again for hundreds and hundreds of years. The void after leaving, when obedience falls away, there's a terrifying silence and a false binary. Either follow or fall apart is the story that you were given by the system and those who upheld it. In the system I came from, I could either be a good Mormon, I could be a lazy, inactive, unfaithful, non-obedient Mormon, but everybody around me would have been taught the language and the stories to see me that way. So I could be a really good Mormon, I could be a not so good Mormon, or I could lose belief in the thing, and then the labels that were given were even worse about me. And it really is scary when you start to think for yourself and step away from a system. And it's again, I said at the beginning of the episode, is that it's called the dark night of the soul. And it's called that because you have bought into everything that the system has given you and shared about what you're supposed to be and what it is and how all of life works out. And when you start to step away from that, it's scary. You're not really sure who you are yet. You haven't had time to figure that out. The system has given you tons of stories that are telling you that things are going to go really bad if you lose your faith. Things are going to go way downhill, and you're going to experience lots of sorrow, and horrible things are going to occur because you couldn't keep it together. And so it makes perfect sense that there's this sort of space of time where there's terrifying silence, I think, sort of inside yourself. There's a false binary. You either follow or everything falls apart. And often people whose faith is falling apart will continue to be obedient to the system because they're so scared of what would happen if they live true to the inner thinking of deconstructing that religious system. And I've talked to so many people over the years who kept going to church for another year or two or three, knowing it wasn't true, but scared to death to outwardly align themselves with what they were thinking inside. And so, number one, the void is not a failure. It's freedom under construction. The space you feel isn't a problem, it's a blank canvas. And so as somebody takes apart their religion, they're going to have to also deconstruct their identity. I'm no longer the things that the religious system told me I was. I'm no longer the things that my unhealthy family system told me I was. I'm just who I am. And as I start to live authentically, it's going to bump up against my relationships in that system or unhealthy family. It's going to bump up against the expectations I used to have of myself. It's going to bump up against the expectations that the other community members had of me. And it's going to feel like uh, a turmoil, like a disaster. But in reality, it really is a blank canvas. You're starting from scratch. You no longer are bound to those concepts and ideas that were handed down to you. You now have to figure out who you are, and so it is a blank canvas, and you get to be the painter, and you get to figure out what it means to be you, and what it means to live your life going forward. Number two, you were trained to fear your own compass. So naturally asking, what do I want, feels selfish. It feels dangerous. Um, the system told you to always compromise your wants, to concede your needs to what the system or God or the leaders require of you, need of you. And so you were taught to not trust your own intuition and to fear your own inner compass. And you were taught that to disregard what the system says in order to live your autonomous, authentic life was you being self centered, you not making the sacrifice that the gospel calls for. And um, it's a scary thing when you start to think and then act in ways that the system didn't want you to. And you have to, my suggestion is you have to really get comfortable with it. You have to know well enough internally that you're on the right track. And for me, this came when I studied like Fowler's stages of faith or different stages of cognitive development. I realized that this process was growth. All of the experts in various religious fields, as well as just in the secular world, were all speaking of the same thing, which was that as my growth was happening, my brain was developing and thinking in new ways, and it no longer thought in the black and white paradigms of the past. It welcomed nuance. It stopped wanting the certainty of what the system gave me in terms of answers. I started to feel that curiosity was a good thing, and I started to thrive in the questions, even the ones that couldn't be answered at all. Um, and people have to get comfortable with this discomfort, because in the early stages, you're going to feel lost. You're not going to sense that this is the beginning of something really big and important happening in your world. And then the last one, it's not chaos, it's detox. The absence of control feels like chaos only because control was the false sense of safety. And so I see a lot of people who leave Mormonism. And we were just out to dinner last night with some friends, and they were talking about knowing people who, after they stepped away from the church, they got into drinking really heavy. I've known people who have gotten into sexual promiscuity. I've known people who have made really drastic decisions with their life. And from the outside looking in, if you're in the religious system that person just left, you're like, oh my goodness. Oh, that's what happens when you lose your faith. And you tell yourself like, oh, then I'm never going to lose my faith, because if I did, like, look what happens. And the reality is that when you've been raised from a child, from your childhood, to see the world a certain way, when you determine later in life that that's actually not the way the world works, you should be given some grace to figure that out. And I think often the extreme behaviors happen because it's not only a figuring things out, it's also an act of rebellion, because everybody decided that you leaving was bad. And if we could make, and again, the system's never going to do that, but if there were enough of us on the outside who, when we saw someone taking their system apart, if we could give them some support, some connection, and model for them that you've been through that before, I think people will generally make much better decisions if they feel a sense of safety to explore it and to figure it out. And if they have uh, someone's experience to lean on, knowing how those things worked out for other people making those kinds of decisions. Any thoughts you have on these three things?
Yes. So I think for a lot of people in high demand fundamentalist religious systems, they sort of skipped out on their teenage phase of rebellion. They never got to kind of rebel. And it's funny because I grew up in a family where they were not active Mormons, and so I was the active Mormon, so I always said I rebelled backwards because I was doing all the, church stuff, and I was trying to be a good girl and, not drinking and smoking and all the things that my family did that were normal. But I think for a lot of people, they never really got the opportunity to have this rebellious phase, and so when they do leave, there is a bit of that chaos, and they're sort of cleansing their system for all the suppression that they've had of trying to being forced to sort of be this person that they don't really know that they are. And so it's sort of a rite of passage that they never got. The other thing that I'm going to say is that, in trauma work, we call this void the liminal space. And this is where old strategies are going to fall away. Uh, but new ones haven't formed yet. So it's, like you call it, the dark night of the soul. That's also a really apt term. And a lot of people that are going through this phase, they feel like they are doing something wrong. It feels so bad and so unfamiliar and so uncertain and so unknown that they feel like they have to have been doing something really wrong. And it also, on some level, may reinforce to them what their system may have told them, which is, this is the path of happiness, and anything outside of this is going to be dangerous and wrong and bad, and you're not going to be able to, feel good. And so to just remind people, and by the way, this happens all the time. This liminal space thing can happen if you've had a divorce, if you've lost a loved one, if you like so many different transitions, if you've shifted out of a career, um, any kind of shift or transition, there's going to be this sense of void or this liminal space where you've left something, but you haven't sort of put the new thing in place, and so it is uncomfortable. And as you were saying before, it's part of the process is learning to get comfortable with the discomfort. But first, we have to know that it's okay, that it's normal, that it's not wrong, that we haven't taken a wrong step, that this is sort of to be expected. It's part of the process. And I just want to reiterate that to people. And I went through this. I've gone through a couple dark nights of the soul, but the biggest one was when I went through chronic illness, and I lost my job. I lost so many aspects of my life, and I had this breakdown process, and I didn't know when I was going to come back into the rebuilding of my life. And I had no, yeah, there's just was total uncertainty around it. And I described it on some level as falling into the abyss of nothingness. And as you're sort of things are falling away in your life because you step away from something that gave you all the answers, you can feel like you're free falling into nothing and you don't know when you're going to hit the bottom. And it is really terrifying. But eventually you do you do hit the ground, and you do start to come into the rebuilding process, and that part can be really exciting. And so my coaching company is called Monarch Integrative Coaching, and the reason why I chose that is because of the metaphor of the butterfly, and so this is also connected to that, which is, when a caterpillar forms a chrysalis, it basically dissolves into a pile of goo. It completely disintegrates what it was, and then reforms itself into a butterfly. And I held on to that metaphor for a lot of my process because it really helped me understand, okay, this is really okay. I can trust this. And that doesn't mean I trusted it every day, because there were so many days where I thought, no, I cannot trust this. This is insane. So I'll just encourage you to keep going and to really give yourself permission to just be in the icky part of it.
Yeah, using that analogy, the caterpillar or the person inside the system begins to think differently. They're starting to awaken. They go into the cocoon, and and into that process, they're neither caterpillar nor butterfly. And it's a fragile moment. I mean, if you cut that cocoon open, that animal's not going to make it. Um, that caterpillar, which is no longer a caterpillar, doesn't understand what exactly it's going to be. The person leaving the system and having this fragile dark night of the soul doesn't know what the future holds. And all they know is that they're losing their community. They're losing their identity. They don't know up from down. They don't know who to trust or how to explain what's going on. And again, it's a very delicate moment. But like the caterpillar, the person deconstructing will become and turn into a beautiful thing if they have some safety, if they're allowed to develop inside the cocoon, if they have that safety, and if they have enough resources and enough mentors of people who have gone before, who can give them some stability, they'll become a beautiful butterfly.
One,
And yes,
can I
please.
offer one thing just right now? Sorry, my mic is doing weird things. I'm going to go into this in more detail in the second part of this, but I want to just offer a reframe. I'm really big on open-ended questions to ask yourself, almost like a mantra. But as you're going through this process, there's a couple of questions you can just ask yourself every now and again and just sit with it. But one of them is, if I trusted that this part of the journey had value, how might I treat myself differently? And you can just ask the question and sit with it. And then the other one is, what's trying to grow here that wouldn't grow in my old environment? And just kind of hold on to this. It kind of gets your brain to reframe and rethink of what's happening in the process. And that can really help you to stay more open-minded, to be less fearful, to have a resource so that you're not going into this state of anxiety or fear. And you're just taking it one day at a time, one moment at a time.
Yeah, and I'll add that this moment of luminal space is so important to what happens later. You developing your own unique grounded voice is this moment in time is going to play a gigantic part of that. Your ability to know what works and what doesn't is going to come out of this moment. You're leaning into trusting yourself and sensing that no one is the authority for you, that is the movie Kamari, the documentary Kamari tried to say the guru is inside of you. There are so many things that in this space of uncertainty and destabilization and not knowing whether things are coming or going, it really is an important part where so many later tools will have their roots here. And so I would just say, like, as you're pointing out, this is really an important moment in the process, and for people to just sit still with what's happening. And as you point out, some of these questions that you can ask yourself can be a big help. I'll just say here, integrity. Integrity, as we're using it here, isn't about morality. It isn't about virtue signaling. It isn't about being right all the time. It's about congruence, the alignment between your inner truth and your outer life. It means living in a way that honors your instincts, your values, your voice, even when those things make others uncomfortable. Integrity starts in the body. It's the quiet knowing in your gut. It's the tension in your chest when you betray yourself. It's the calm that follows the choice that feels authentically yours. It's not the absence of doubt, but rather it's the presence of internal honesty. Integrity doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. And what I would say here is that inside a family system that's unhealthy, inside an unhealthy religious system, integrity is measured by whether you do what they say and that you stay away from the things they tell you to stay away from. But real integrity And if we understand sort of the spectrum of humanity, everybody's different. We all have different values. I, I've I've seen people have disagreement with each other, and it's been harsh. Like both people are just so sure they're right, and they're berating the other person, trying to fight for rightness. When if you just sat still for a minute and you could get both of them to just slow down and talk to each other based on why these perspectives are important to each other, pro-life, pro-choice, for instance, you would learn that somebody's life experience, the way they were raised, the things they believe in, the family history that they've had, the genetics that they have, all play a part in how one comes to feel the way they do about things. And there can be a disagreement on really big issues, and it feels like one person should be right and the other wrong, when in reality both just come to this conversation as two different human beings, and they come to this topic just very differently, and neither really are wrong and neither are really right. They both have merit to their perspectives, they just disagree. And integrity integrity is about getting aligned with your inner self. So who you are inside can be different. So the religion teaches that all 100 people showing up on Sunday all need to do the same thing. And integrity in that space is measured by all of you checking the boxes and living the rules and following the gospel. But in the world, the way integrity works is that my gut is telling me that I should show up in the world a certain way, and I'm betraying myself by not doing that. I'm harming somebody, and I know inside that that was the wrong thing to do, that I took care of my own interest at the uh, deficit of someone else. And so integrity, in the sense that we're using it, is about a congruence between how you show up in the world and what you feel about how you should show up in the world inside. And that when you shortcut who you really are internally, that's a lack of integrity. And it makes room. Again, we're not justifying anybody being different in ways that harm others, but outside of harming someone, people should have a full freedom to be different than the person next to them. And there isn't a lack of integrity because people are different and they disagree. Integrity comes in when you betray the person that you want to be inside. So you say, I want to be honest. And then you go out in the world and you're dishonest, and you can tell when when you're inconsistent with who you are internally. And you can notice that self-betrayal. And I'll just say, I'm certainly not perfect. There are lots of things I do wrong, but it would be really difficult for me to pick moments in my life, in the modern moment, where I'm not having integrity with myself. I'll make mistakes, but I come around really quickly because I know who I am inside, and I want to continually try to keep showing up that way. And I'm really happy with the congruence between my internal world and my external world. And but I didn't always feel that way. If I go back, 5 years ago, and especially if I go back 10 or 15 years ago, what was going on in my head and in my body versus how I would show up in the world were polar opposites at times. And they were very incongruent. And it's quite obvious to the me now that the me then had a significant lack of integrity. Any thoughts on integrity?
Yes. So, um, yeah. So I mean, I can relate with this personally because, you were talking about how sometimes, if you have like a value that you want to be honest and you're out of integrity with that, you can feel that. But there's also, especially for a lot of people who are performers, this comes from people who've been in high demand fundamentalist religions, and they're taught to suppress their true inner desires or needs. Being out of integrity can be something like what happened to me the other day. There was a part in me that came up that was really a very sensitive part that, in the past I'd felt really shamed about my sensitivity. And this part came up and I kind of bypassed it. I kind of put it to the back burner, like, oh, well, that's not important to acknowledge this sensitivity part. And I felt some shame around that part. And there was this, a certain point, there was a couple days that where something was sort of brewing underneath the surface, and I started feeling a lot of anxiety and tension, and that was a signal for me that I was out of integrity because I was performing and bypassing this part. And as soon as I took the time to slow down and acknowledge and get connected to that part, I used some parts work processes, like, my whole system just kinda woke up again. It felt like it was back in alignment. I felt like I had myself back. I felt joy, I felt peace, I felt so much better. And so I wanted to just share a couple of ways that you can know when you are out of integrity with yourself. And, it's like, I think you actually have maybe the next slide. Show the next slide because I think that'll speak to this. Yeah. So, for example, like when there are two or more parts that are in constant debate, or when you have a yes, but feel maybe a strong no in your body, that's going to show that you're out of integrity. When you do something that you immediately regret, or you feel resentment or self betrayal. But some other signs that people may not be aware of are physiological signs. So, our bodies will tell us when we're not in integrity, when there's an internal conflict. So you may have chronic fatigue. You may have a feeling of being numb or apathetic. I think this happens for a lot of people where they just don't feel a luster for life anymore. You may be sitting with a lot of heavy resentment in your life because you've been telling people yes when you really mean no, and then you can feel resentment towards those people. Your energy is going to drain more quickly around certain people, or if you have to do certain tasks or play certain roles. There are times that you can feel, like I said, emotionally flat or detached from your life. And then another thing is you you may get into that place of over explaining or over justifying what you're doing. And then, anxiety, shame, and tightness in your system or your body. So just, be aware that sometimes our system does tell us when we are out of integrity, when there is not congruence, and it can show up in these sort of physiological or emotional ways. And we've been taught for so long to bypass that, to just keep shoving it down. But if something is sort of stewing there, you can feel it bubbling up. Just that's your cue to start paying attention to it. So, sometimes, again, because we've never been taught that it's okay to choose ourselves. It's okay to kind of trust our gut and stuff like that. So it's just a process of learning how to read your own cues and playing around with it, trying things on, learning how to say maybe no when your mind's telling you yes, but your body's saying no, and then just sitting with what comes up with that. So that's what I was thinking about when it comes to this whole concept of integrity. And it's a really weird because we've been taught that integrity is such a different thing. Coming into this definition of what integrity really is, I think is very foreign for a lot of people. Um, and so there's just some like different little questions here that talk about how to explore integrity misalignments. And one question you can ask yourself is, where in my life do I feel like I'm performing more than showing up authentically? Another question is, when do I feel most like I'm betraying myself, and what story justifies it? What part of me is asking for more honesty, even if it's uncomfortable? And then the last one is, where am I still living by someone else's rules or expectations? So you can just ask yourself some of these questions and sit with what comes up.
Yeah. And I think this image tackles the topic today as well as anything else in this slideshow. It's the idea that when you're being obedient because you would choose to do something else if you weren't required to be obedient. So anytime that and again, this image, anytime you're saying something or doing something and your body's going, you didn't want to say that. You didn't want to do that. You didn't like the way you showed up there. That's obedience. That, again, it's not, I'm going to talk about the moments where you're being dishonest to cover your tracks. I'm talking about the moments where you show up in the world because authority figures have told you that's the way you have to show up, or they have made some sort of threat against you. And it can be something like your salvation's at stake. It can be something about you'll be seen as unfaithful. You'll be seen as a sinner. At the moment you show up outwardly in a way that your internal structure doesn't want you to show up that way, you're choosing obedience over integrity. When you have integrity internally, you're going to say, you're going to show up, you're going to do what your internal structures want you to say, do, show up. And as you pointed out, both just a moment ago as well as earlier, you can feel these things. It's something I've often this podcast, I'm always worried. I stammer a lot. I have these worries about coming off arrogant. But one of the things I think I do really well is I can feel whether something is appropriate or not. And you'll often hear me in content that I create when we're talking about a moral issue or the way that people are behaving in religious systems. I'll often ask the audience to just sit still for a second and feel what this act feels like. Because if you can get into your body and go, ooh, that's gross. An example is in Mormonism, they allow 7-year-old children to go into a room with a closed door and sit with a male stranger. And there have been cases of abuse that have occurred. And we all recognize out in the real world, we wouldn't send our 7-year-old to go into a closed room with the neighbor guy who lives, 10 houses down that we don't know. And he's a stranger man to my kid. We wouldn't let that happen. But in religious settings, we let things happen that we wouldn't let happen otherwise. And if I ask the audience right now to just sit still for a second and just feel as a parent what it means to send your kid into a room, close the door, and there's a stranger man. Again, you call him Bishop, but effectively to that kid, he's a stranger. And he's asking your child certain kinds of questions, and there's room there for him to go too far in the questioning. And even the questions as they are have problems. And every parent should feel something about that is something on the unhealthy side. And yet in a religious setting, we justify it. But if we just go off what our gut tells us, we would not justify things simply because it's a religious setting and religious authorities have taught us that it's okay. We would notice that it's not okay in every other setting, and it's not okay in this setting either. And so people, if you would just feel these moments, and you come to a moment where there's an ethical thing happening, there's a moral thing happening, and you can just, instead of being in your head, because your head's been trained to think about it a certain way, if you just go into your gut, often you can just feel the truth of it. And I think it's such a valuable tool as one is working away from obedience to a system towards integrity with oneself. One is going to have to learn to sit with, weigh the merit of, feel out the things that are going on internally around those kinds of decisions and moments.
Yeah, I just want to say, when we are out of integrity, our aliveness goes offline to protect us from the dissonance. So that's a telltale sign.
I like that, because there are moments where I've been part of, or others have drawn attention to something's not right here. And the people who, out of obedience, feel pressured to protect the system will often come up with thought-stopping techniques, thought-stopping sentences, or dismiss the problem, or just say, well, we just have to trust our leaders. We just have to have faith. We just have to trust that God will figure it out on the other side. And those all seem like an effort to step away from feeling the problem of what's going on at that moment. So I love that. That's a great point. And this is my last slide. Redefining integrity. Integrity isn't morality. Again, the system teaches you that integrity is morality. It gives you a moral code. You keep the moral code, you have integrity. You break the moral code, you don't. But it determines the rules. The rules are always changing. The rules from the Old Testament have been discarded. Some from the New Testament have been discarded. Some from the modern religion that you're in have been discarded. It's constantly shifting and changing. It's not consistent. But whatever they say it is, it is. And that's how integrity is decided. But that's not what it is. It's congruence. It's living in alignment with your truth, not someone else's rules. And so there's these three things I want to end on, which is integrity does not equal always being right. I am wrong. I sometimes bring my intuition to a moment. I have feelings about something, but I don't have enough I think I have enough information. I'm making a decision, and I make the decision and I get more information. And I find out I was wrong. I misjudged something. I made an assumption. I jumped to a conclusion. There are those moments. And there's also space to just make mistakes. We're allowed to make errors. And this life is about learning, and mistakes are going to happen. And there are times where I make a mistake and I go like, oh, okay, here's what I was feeling. Here's what I was thinking. I can see why I ended up doing that. But in the future, I want to be more aligned with my internal self. And in the future, I want to make a different decision. I want to make that decision differently. It means being honest. So here it says it means being honest with yourself, even when your truth is messy or evolving. You're allowed to evolve. You're allowed to be messy. You're allowed to have parts that think differently about various topics. You're allowed to have parts that have different values. You're allowed to be in disagreement with yourself, and you're allowed to sort all of that out. But it's the work and process of becoming more and more aligned that is growth and progress, and the track of stepping away from obedience into integrity. Number 2, integrity starts in your body. I said this earlier. Long before I know the truth of a moment that's ethics, morals, healthy or unhealthy, long before I have a logical way to articulate that, my body can feel the truth of it. So integrity starts in the body. If your gut says no, but your mouth says yes, you're out of alignment. So back to the picture we showed earlier. And then number 3, wholeness over approval. Living with integrity may cost you validation. It may cost you relationships and friendships. It may cost you connection with others. It may cost you membership in a group or tribe, but it gives you yourself in return. You feeling congruent, you feeling consistent outwardly and inwardly is of monumental value. And I think I think learning that has value is part of the process. I think it is natural on the early stages of this to distrust that, to go, it's just not worth losing my tribe. It's just not worth losing this relationship. And then you compromise yourself over and over and over again. And I think it's that process of compromising yourself over and over again that you learn that in reality, you really don't want to do that anymore. And so I think people have to be given the room that this process is messy, and it involves you making the same mistakes over and over as you try to please others, as you try to get validation from others, and you keep coming to the end of that, realizing that you're giving yourself up. And then when you have that happen enough, you'll move into some sort of congruence And you'll notice that that was by far way better than constantly trying to get the validation or the approval of others. Any thoughts there?
Yes, just that coming home to yourself is such a beautiful thing, and it is it's not a it's not a straightforward process. It's messy and bumpy, but it is really amazing. It's when the noise in your system dies down and you can sit in peace, you can sit in stillness, you can be at home in yourself. And yeah, so that's sort of where you're aiming for. And it's not, I'll say this too, like a lot of times we think of healing as like there's a destination. Oh, I get to this place and I'm finally healed. But this is really a process, and I think it's a lifelong journey. So don't set expectations for yourself that you're going to someday arrive at healing. Just be open to the glimmers along the way, because you'll have new moments or new levels of connection to yourself. And so there's no final arrival point where you've reached nirvana or whatever. So just let yourself have what unfolds in each moment, and give yourself lots and lots of permission for it to just be messy as hell, and for you to make lots of mistakes, and to know that the more quote unquote mistakes or failures you have, all you're learning in that moment is what isn't working. So that helps you to understand or get closer to what is going to work. So just don't see it as something that it's a mistake or a failure. Just see it as, you are sort of checking off all the things that weren't the one or weren't the thing that worked. It's something that supports and helps you to find what's truly in alignment for you. So that's what I'll say about this whole process. And I'm excited to kind of dive into, I hate that word. I sound like AI. I'm excited to talk more about, different ways that we can come home to ourselves, different ways that we can move through this process with a little bit more ease and support, and how we can resource ourselves as we're going through this process. So
I think coming home to yourself is the most important journey that every human will take. And we were born into this world, us, and then things happened, and we had to protect ourselves. And so we developed mechanisms. We preferenced compromising ourselves to get the approval of others. And we did whatever was necessary in order to ensure our as much safety and survival as we could. But on this side of things, we have the power and ability to find ourselves again. And I hope that folks will trust that process. And I'm excited to join back up with you next week to have the second half of this conversation. In the meantime, folks, we very much appreciate your tuning in and joining the show. Please like and subscribe to the video as you're watching it. And we'll see you next week for another episode of the Almost Awakened podcast. Have a great day, everybody. And thank you for joining us. Check us out at almostawakened.org. And if you would be so kind as to support the program, please click the donate button. Anything, $5 a month, $10 a month would be deeply helpful as we continue to have conversations that explore our external and internal world. And we'll do that again next week when we get the second half of obedience to integrity. So long, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Almost Awakened podcast. For more tools, resources, and real talk about conscious living, visit almostawakened.org. That's almostawakened.org, your resource for waking up